Hello, this is my interview with award-winning journalist Isabel Hardman, who has written this book, Why We Get the Wrong Politicians. She's been working in the House of Commons since 2011. She's also a campaigner for mental health, and I hope you find this interview interesting. So, Isabel, you started as a journalist, well, in Parliament in 2011, and you saw for yourself the dysfunctional nature of Parliament.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a couple of things you talk about in the book about? You talk really. It's not a problem of politicians being that we have the wrong perception of politicians possibly, and it's more about Parliament.
Yeah, I think most politicians are decent people who've gone into politics for the right reasons, or at least the same mixture of reasons that the rest of us go into our jobs. You know, I became a journalist because I believe that writing can help people and can change people's lives, but I also find it quite fun. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of people who go into politics as well. And the longer I worked in Parliament, the more I saw that there were things that I couldn't defend. And they tended to be, obviously there were MPs who did bad things, who were selfish, but they were very much in the minority. It was more the system of scrutinising legislation, or not scrutinising legislation, as I've really found out over the years, which leads to horrendous crises for normal people as a result of badly designed and badly scrutinised policies. And I think that's why people are actually really frustrated with politicians, because there's this mixture of the really bad news stories about the really bad ones, and then terrible policies which are coming out. And I think the public often think, well, are they actually doing their job? Do they actually care? How has this happened to me? How has this benefit been cut, leaving me destitute? Or, you know, how has this transport policy been so rubbish that I can never catch a train that turns up? All of these things that people find frustrating and wonder whether actually anyone's properly doing their job. And so just to go deeper into that problem with the legislation, there are so many bills going through Parliament that MPs have very little time to actually read them. And it's often the case that MPs will go and vote on these pieces of legislation without knowing the detail of what they'll entail. Now, obviously, they'll know the overall thrust of something. They'll know, for instance, that the welfare reform bill, when it was going through the House of Commons under the coalition, contained a number of cuts to housing benefit, and they'll probably know what those housing benefit cuts will involve, such as, for instance, a cut to the amount of benefits that's paid to people who are living in houses that are bigger than they need. And you'd think as an MP, well, that sounds reasonable because we've got a massive overcrowding crisis in social housing. You know, how could I vote against this? I've got to support it. Actually, if they'd looked at the detail of that policy, they would have realised that there weren't enough smaller homes for people in social housing to then move into, and which is why we ended up with the row over what then became known as the bedroom tax. And a lot of MPs didn't actually realise the problems with that policy until tenants in their own constituencies came to them in their surgeries and said, I can't afford my rent anymore. And so they then wrote to the housing associations saying, you've put my constituents' rent up. And the housing associations, I mean, I spoke to them at the time, they wrote back saying, actually, no, you've cut their benefits and you recently voted for it. And there was this kind of, you know, the scales fell from their eyes because they realised that they'd approved something that wasn't working. And that's just one recent example. The book's got so many examples where actually if MPs had looked at something first, we probably wouldn't have had so many policy disasters, which we've seen over the past few years.
As you say, there's a huge disconnect between the public and politicians. You talk about how they are the least liked professional class, more so than bankers, estate agents,
journalists.
How can we bridge the gap? Do you think?
I mean, I think there's a mixture. I don't think politicians have ever been particularly well liked. So it's not as though things have got, you know, particularly bad recently. The expenses scandal, to a certain extent, articulated the dislike that people already had for politicians. It just gave people a reason, a sort of more tangible reason for really, I think in some cases, actually hating the political class. I think the fact that politicians don't look like the British public at large is a real problem as well. You know, Parliament is nowhere near as ethnically diverse as this country. It is, I think it's a third now, a third of MPs now are women, but we've only just recently passed the number of MPs elected to Parliament in the whole of history being women being equal to the number of male MPs sitting on the green benches at that present time, which is just a terribly slow state of progress. Similarly, we've never had a transgender MP. We have very few disabled MPs. So it's not representative. And then we move on to class or economic background. And again, you're more likely to have been to a private school, although that is reducing actually. That with each intake, we have fewer and fewer private school educated MPs. But the one thing which is really missing from a lot of these background statistics that you can get on MPs is what they've done in the interim. So we have MPs with great backstories. That's what we always talk about in the press. People like Sajid Javid, who, his father came to this country with £1 in his pocket, drove a bus. Very similar actually to Sadiq Khan's father. There's lots of bus driving fathers who've had sons who've gone into Parliament. But what you don't see in the interim is that Sadiq Khan then became a banker. Sajid Javid then became a banker and earned a great deal of money. And that's great for him. That's fantastic. But the fact is that if you are to become an MP, you have to spend a lot of money to be able to do that. I did a survey for the book of, I think it was over 600 people who'd stood in the 2015 election, and the average personal cost for those candidates, whether they were in a safe seat that they were definitely going to win, in a no-hope seat that there was no chance they were going to get anywhere near, or a marginal seat, was £11,000. And that's not party spending, that's not spending on leaflets, that's not on campaign literature, that's on the business of working for free for 2 years to try to get a job. I mean, it's the most expensive and time-consuming job interview in the world, and it filters out a huge number of people. And those costs obviously go up if you're in a marginal seat. So Labour candidates, for instance, in 2015, I think lost around £35,000 to lose their marginal seat. Now, these sums of money are unimaginable to most people. That's the deposit on the house that you might save up until your sort of late 30s, early 40s to be able to afford. And it's fine for those who can somehow manage it. Maybe they're working in government already, which reduces the cost significantly because it's much easier to take time off than it is, for instance, if you're a teacher. But it does mean that we're filtering out people not according to ability, but according to financial means. And that's not a great way of ensuring we've got the brightest and best going into Parliament.
And the middle section talks about how we get the wrong policies. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Sure. So I go through some of the bad policies that Parliament has passed over the past few years, and that ranges across domestic, foreign policy. I think most people, when they start talking about what's wrong with politics, the conversation generally takes a turn towards the word Iraq at some point. And I've looked at not whether or not it was right to go to war, but the process of scrutiny around that and the ways in which it was very difficult for MPs to actually get hold of the information they needed, particularly when it came to looking at planning for the aftermath of the conflict. And as we've seen, not just in Iraq, in Afghanistan, but also more recently in Libya, post-conflict planning is not something that governments do very well. And it's really important that MPs make sure that there is a plan for the aftermath of an invasion, of some kind of intervention, because it damages discussion about foreign policy further down the line. Iraq is now something that haunts every single foreign policy debate. So when I was sitting in on the debates on intervention in Syria in 2013, people kept calling Assad Saddam by mistake because they were still thinking back to decisions that Tony Blair made. And so it's really important for the future that politicians get these decisions right. Another example is the Omnishambles budget, which was in 2012. And that was George Osborne's budget. He had lots of very clever ideas for simplifying the tax code in it. But a lot of them turned out to hurt people who from working class backgrounds, and a lot of those people are Sun readers, and you don't really want to get on the wrong side of Sun readers because their newspaper is very vocal and very powerful. So there were taxes on pasties, on caravans, all sorts of things that the Sun really didn't like. And the reason that George Osborne had agreed to these changes was, even though he's a very bright man, very intellectually curious, he was surrounded by people who were just like him from very similar comfortable backgrounds. And there wasn't anyone who said, not sure this is going to work with, a working class constituency here. And you saw that many years ago with the poll tax, where it was cooked up by a lot of people who have very similar backgrounds. Apparently there was one civil servant a bit later down the line who said try collecting that in Brixton, because they had an instinctive grasp of how this was going to go. And lo and behold, trying to collect it anywhere, let alone Brixton, didn't go particularly well at all. And so the failures that we see early on in terms of who gets into politics and then how politicians are able to use their time, then manifest themselves in disastrous policies.
Now, I wasn't going to ask you this, but there's a lot of people on the left, because you mentioned Syria, Iraq, Libya, and now Trump looks like he could start a civil war in Venezuela. I think it's fair to say that as lovely as you are, I would say, on the rise. What do you think about sort of moving on beyond sort of neoliberal politics?
I mean, I don't really look at, my book isn't really, I hope it comes across as not party political. I'm not, I work for The Spectator. I obviously believe that markets can have a great role in lifting people out of poverty. You see that in the developing world, that they can make a huge difference to people's lives. But I'm not particularly wedded to an ideology, definitely not a set of party beliefs. And that's why in the book I try to look at failures that the Conservatives and the Labour Party have made, because for me it's about how Parliament works. And so if you're somebody who thinks that there is a, give it whatever name you like, a neoliberal policy that's going through Parliament, then you should be able to raise concerns with the way that it's designed. And I don't think at the moment that's the case on either side. So if, for instance, if Labour's in government and you're a Labour MP and you're very worried about an economic policy that Chancellor John McDonnell has drawn up, are you actually able to raise concerns about that in Parliament or in a bill committee and ensure that that policy is going to work well for your party? At the moment, there's no incentive to do that. You're seen as a troublemaker, a rebel, as opposed to somebody who actually cares about decent legislation being produced. We'll just look at an example of the legal aid cuts, which the Conservatives and Lib Dems introduced at in sort of 2011, 2012. Now, I went through the bill committee for the legal aid cuts, and the Conservative MPs on the bill committee, they understood the legal world. A lot of them were either lawyers or had done a great deal of research work on legal reform. And they were being presented with a bill that a lot of people were saying wasn't going to work. It wasn't going to save the amount of money that the Treasury had predicted. It was going to cut off access to justice for vulnerable people. At one stage, there were some changes made, but at one stage it was going to cut off access to justice for women escaping domestic violence, for instance. But there were warnings back at the time that it might cause miscarriages of justice, that you would have people representing themselves in court, and that, I started out when I was training doing a lot of court reporting, and court is very difficult to understand, even if you're just in the gallery. If you're a defendant, that's a completely different matter. It's really difficult without a legal representative. And these Conservative MPs were being warned this in the evidence sessions that happened at the start of the bill committee. And yet their attitude was to basically try to undermine the witnesses who were from, the Law Society, various law charities, who were giving all of these warnings. And then when it came to going line by line through the bill, which is what a bill committee is supposed to do, they saw their role as just getting this bill through as easily as possible without any problems at all. They were obviously in the majority on the committee, because bill committees have an inbuilt government majority on them, which I think is right, because if you've got a government that's been elected by the people, you want it to be able to get its business through. But the problem is that the culture of the House of Commons means that those MPs from the governing party don't see their role as being to check that their party is introducing the best legislation possible that's going to work, that's going to, from a purely political point of view, ensure that their party's reputation stays strong. Their role is just to shut up. And this is something that MPs from all sides have said to me, that when their party is in government, they go into a committee and the whips say, right, shut up, and this will take a very small amount of time. And if you do pipe up in bill committees, you don't get asked back. And so you tend to be the loyal ones. And this is no way it's no way to govern, but it's also no way for Parliament to work, because Parliament is supposed to keep the executive in check. It's supposed to make sure that people are being properly represented and that the government isn't so powerful that it can introduce useless legislation. So whether it's neo-liberal or hard left or whatever terms people want to use to criticise certain policies, there should be a mechanism for people from all parts of the political spectrum, even those who have an instinctive belief in those ideas, to make sure that those ideas are being implemented properly, because there's a big difference between a grand idea, a grand design that someone has when they're sitting in their ministerial office, and then its actual practical implementation. And at the moment, I don't think Parliament is paying nearly enough attention to that. I know I've slightly sidestepped your question, but I don't do the sort of the party politics stuff. I find it much more interesting to look at the system, because that will endure whoever's in government and however many MPs we have who people find annoying or whatever. It's going to be the case over the next, unfortunately, over the next decade, whatever happens in British politics. And there's not much else I can predict, but I have quite a bit of certainty about that.
Mm-hmm. Changing the subject now, you're quite a mental health campaigner. Could you perhaps say something about what you think needs to change in government, how as a society in Britain we could look after people better with on mental health?
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a lot more money, basically, and the NHS long-term plan does have an allocation of funds for mental health, but it's nowhere near enough to ensure that people are getting the right primary care, for instance, so that when somebody first starts to show symptoms of an illness, that they're getting a quick diagnosis, that they're getting access to talking therapies quickly. The plans for mental health in terms of targets for access to psychological therapies, I think I don't have the figures to hand, but it's a very small percentage. I think it's 23% of people who need it will be able to access a psychological therapy at the end of the 5-year forward view for mental health. And that's tiny. And these are only psychological therapies, when this is sort of CBT and counselling. This isn't schema therapy or other therapies for more complex illnesses such as post-traumatic stress disorder, borderline personality disorder, bipolar. That people with, I guess depression can be very, very severe, but people with the really psychotic illnesses in particular actually just get very little treatment at all until they become an inpatient. And the cost of a mental health inpatient bed is extraordinary, thousands of pounds every night. There aren't enough acute beds for people, so people get bussed around the country if they get a bed at all. And then at the end of their months, however long in hospital, they end up being discharged with a care plan which basically has a helpline number on it, and that's it. So you go from being, I guess, institutionalized to a certain extent, because you're very rarely allowed out of your ward when you're a mental health inpatient. Psychiatric wards are often locked, and so you might go to buy some chocolate and some cigarettes, but you don't tend to go outside very much. Then suddenly you're back in the outside world, you're going back home, you've got your bills, you've got everything in everyday life that all of us can find overwhelming, and you're on your own again, which is actually one of the reasons why we've seen an increase in rough sleeping over the past few years. Another one of those is actually the lack of access to addiction treatment, and that has gone down under the Conservatives as well. And it's hugely frustrating as someone who has a mental illness. I've got PTSD, and I've had to spend my own money to get treated, which has been all right for me. I'm not going to complain because I've got the money, or at least I had the money until I spent it all on my mental illness. But that's not fair for most people. Most people don't have a savings account that they can dig into. I've been having therapy for over 2 years now. Who has that money? I could have become an MP, I guess, on the amount of money I've spent on my therapy. But this isn't fair, because people often compare mental and physical health and say, well, if you break your leg, you wouldn't be expected to self-fund the cast, would you? And we don't have a national health service that's free at the point of access, actually, for a lot of people with mental illnesses. And that's just not right. It's just not right.
Isabel, that's great. Thanks very much.
Cool. Great.